Hello everyone. This lecture is part of a paper on media, culture and society. This lecture will make you rethink the concept of gender by looking at it from the perspective of a gender relation and not necessarily through a distinction between sex and gender. It will discuss the concept of gender from an Indian perspective where it intersects with caste, nation, religion, age and region. The cultural texts of gender are used and interpreted by the media, thereby reinforcing and reproducing the gender relations more robustly in the society. This lecture further discusses how media indulges in politics of representation by stereotyping women into fixed category. Reflections on the concept of gender. The concept of gender has been used in at least two very different and indeed somewhat contradictory ways. On one hand, the term gender originated as a contrasting category to sex to depict that it is socially constructed as opposed to something which is given biologically. On the other hand, gender has been increasingly used to refer to any social construction dealing with the male and female distinction, including those constructions that separate male bodies from female bodies. Therefore, it would not be wrong to argue that if the body is seen through social interpretation, then sex is not something that is separate from gender, rather is subsumable under it. This becomes a valid argument against the distinction between sex and gender. Understanding gender in Indian context. Now in India, the issue of gender has entered the lexicon of feminist struggle through a very different trajectory from that followed in the West. Historically, the women's movement in India can be classified into two phases. First, as a part of the nationalist struggle, a period of reformist movement, when first men and later women took up women's issues. Many women organizations also emerged, spearheading the struggle against social evils and advancing the cause of female education and female franchisee. After a long gap, a second and more militant phase of women's organization emerged in the 1970s, which directly challenged the patriarchal social order while rallying around issues of violence against women like dowry deaths and rape cases. Thus, it follows that in India, there are no references to theoretical perspective in themselves, rather more. Women activism defines or articulates the issues that frame the problem. Indian feminists also thought of gender as a social construction, but the recognition that gender is historically and socially constructed is not sufficient. What they offer instead is the notion of gender relation. The concept of gender relation implies that the categories need to be analyzed in their relationship, not only at the level of culture and ideologies, but in a range of disparate but articulated context and situations. So here we find the notion of gender emphasizing not only roles and identities, but also relationships with other categories like caste, class, religion, etc. The Western notion of gender, as Mary John argues, still remains a donor category, which has to make its mark here in India. Gender, nation and women's movement in India. There has been a conflation between Indian nation and Indian women during anti-colonial struggle. Women were mobilized in large numbers to take part in the public sphere and became the site to contest colonialism. Women were persuaded to view themselves as capable of a greater virtue than that their nature allows them. This discourse privileged women as the repository of true Indian culture and moral power. Uncontaminated by westernization or other ranges of history, after independence in the 1970s, the women's movement was termed as the second wave feminism in India, There was a shift towards a predominantly feminist agenda, with the problems of rape, dowry, deaths becoming the major issues of concern. The Indian women movement in this sense is a collection of several smaller movements which have grown out of a series of spontaneous reactions against injustices of which they have been victims through the centuries. No doubt the term patriarchy, men as the principal oppressor, comes to explain the subordination of Indian women, but Uma Chakravarti warns that patriarchy is the Indian context has to be situated in its relationship to other structures like caste, class, community and tribe, and also within a historical context. Suma Chitnis similarly argues that in India, patriarchy is only one from among the several hierarchies that oppress women. Some of the most oppressive of these are hierarchies of age, of ordinal status, of relationship by marriage. In support of her argument, she points out that most women in India experience family violence as the cruelty of the mother-in-law or the husband or sisters. This brings out the problem in taking that notion of patriarchy, which solely held men to be the oppressors. Another relevant point that needs to be mentioned here is the tradition-modernity debate in which the Indian woman was located. The impact of modernization on women was that it invariably concentrated on the role conflict of the middle class working women. Women began to have access to formal education and employment. Consequently, there emerged a struggle to get away from Western notion of independent, career-oriented women because it was perceived to be a threat to Indian identity. So the women, although had access to education and employment, were tied to family norms through the institution of marriage. So there was the construction of a new woman who was educated or employed but still looks after her family. There was a proliferation image of a new liberated women who are still grounded in tradition. What clearly emerges from the above accounts is that the notion of selfhood could not be applied to the Indian women. As Kumkum Sanghari rightly remarks when she argues that notions of femaleness, self or identity are so tied up with questions of family, class, religion and other forms of collectivity that they cannot be framed in terms of a single unified axis. Thus, Indian women could never be seen as independent and are always related to family, class, caste, nation and religion, gender and media representations. There are certain institutions involved in the process of construction of gender, the media being one of them. The media through its images represents gender. The main aim of the following discussion is to show that the study of representation of gender must take into account certain questions as where do images come from, who produces images, how meaning is closed down in representation, who is silenced in the production of images, who are representations addressed to or aimed at, and what is at stake in representation. The answers to all these questions bring out the issue of politics of representation. The stereotypical portrayal of women is a result of this politics and an interplay of power and ideology. Spivak, 1988, considers representation as both a political and cultural voice. This combined approach to the concept of representation is highly fruitful to that it avoids some of the naivety of earlier sociological approaches to representation, in which there was the underlying assumption that there was a real woman out there, that the media had the possibility of and responsibility to know and present. In other words, what gets represented in media is drawn from the culture but articulated in order to serve the interest of certain ideologies. In this context, representation performs the function of myths, Roland Barthes argues that myth transforms complex historical process into shorthand, then appears to be natural. Those who internalize these messages from media actualize them in their daily activities, thereby reproducing the dominant ideology, although the possibility of different readings of that same text is always there. Representation, the concept. In media studies, representation means to present or depict something. The idea of representation as the representation of the world emphasizes the process of construction within any text. Representation for us then refers to the construction in any medium, especially the mass media, of aspects of reality such as people, places, objects, events, cultural identities, and other abstract concepts. Such representations may be in speech or writing as well as still or moving pictures. The term representation thus refers to the processes involved as well as to its product. In this sense, we can understand representation as a medium in that it stands between the real and the reader of the media text. Representation constructs the reality it appears only to describe. It should be noted, however, that the representation which become familiar through constant reuse come to feel natural and unmediated. The boundary between reality and fiction becomes progressively vague or blurred. So what needs to be borne in mind is that the media offers us a representation of reality rather than reality itself. If such is the case, then the question arises, in whose interest is it that the representation is made in a particular way? This brings us to the issue of the politics of representation. Gender and politics of representation. Like representation, gender, when considered from a conventional heterosexual perspective, is also a two-part structure involving the differentiation between men and women. The most typical problem presented by gender is that one term is the binary structure is usually taken as the authentic origin and standard by which the second term is judged and found to be deficient. Needless to mention, media plays an important role in the reiteration of this heterosexual ideal through representations of women and men, which attempts to fix the fluidity of meanings that surround femininity and masculinity. Many objects, not just humans, are represented by the media as being particularly masculine or feminine, particularly in advertising. And we grow up with an awareness of what constitutes appropriate characteristics for each gender. It is undeniable that the media shapes our conceptions of what it means to be male or female. Gender politics are absolutely central to the very project of representation. In men's act of representation, women are often used as symbols for meanings men want to convey. Women, in other words, have been objectified as the very devices of representation and as the signs that bear specific moral or artistic significance in a world created by men. Her sign of taken to be any item which can produce a meaning. The meaning of a sign is determined by its relationship to other signs in the sign system, defined in other words by what it is not. Viewed in this way, woman then has meaning not because it refers to some real pre-given entity that the world tags, but because it is different from another sign man. It is therefore possible to see woman not as a given biologically or psychologically, but as a category produced in signifying practices. Women then stands in a patriarchal culture as a signifier for the male other, bound by a symbolic order in which man can live out his fantasies and obsessions through linguistic command by imposing them on the silent image of a woman, still tied to her place as bearer of meaning, not maker of meaning. This gives us the insight that gender is a semiotic system, a system of meaning based on difference between men and women. It thus reveals that hegemonies and asymmetries of power between men and women. We need to reveal the way in which the dominating male gaze, carrying with it social, political and economic as well as sexual power, relegates women to absence, silence and marginality using a series of increasingly vicious mechanisms. One such mechanism is the process of stereotyping of women that is discussed in detail in the next section of the lecture. Stereotyping as a politics of representation. Stereotypes function by simplifying, by reducing classes of people to a few characteristics by which they are generally said to be identifiable. In other words, a stereotype is a radically reductive way of representing whole communities of people by identifying them with a few key characteristics. These characteristics are often exaggerated and the entire group becomes rendered to single characteristics. Thus, stereotyping reduces, essentializes, naturalizes and fixes differences, and through the operation of power marks the boundaries between the normal and the object, us and them. A postcard from the 1900s depicts a white man kissing a black woman with the verse, "Not particular, I know you're not particular to a fault. Though I'm not sure you will never be sued for assault, you're so fond of women that even a wench attracts your gross fancy despite her strong stench." Coming to terms with gender stereotypes, research on the visual representation of women has shown that women were shown as either overwhelmingly domestic creatures, housewives, mother, or as sexual prizes and accessories to men, bodies to sell products, assistant to male authority figures. The few older women represented tended to be figure of fun, while women from ethnic minorities were visible at all, tended to be shown in highly stereotypical ways. So the normal femininity has been depicted as overwhelmingly young, slim, white and sexual and domestic. The potential consequences of this were highlighted by Gay Tuchman 2000 in her well-known article with a striking title, "The Symbolic Annihilation of Women by the Mass Media." In these words, from children shows to commercial to primetime adventures and situation comedies, television proclaims that women don't count for much. They are underrepresented in television's fictional life. They are symbolically annihilated. It wasn't just a problem of numbers. Either Tuchman asserts that those women who were shown to be working were portrayed as incompetent and inferiors. Even in women's traditional domain of the home, men were shown solving both emotional and practical problems, leaving women with a little value in the television world. Similarly, Indian television advertisements in the late 1980s exhibited many of the same formats and patterns of gender portrayal that American advertisement do, sometimes with nearly identical frequencies. As discussed in the previous section, women in Indian society were always tied to the notion of family, nation, etc., thereby denying them selfhood. This is also reflected in the representation of women in Indian television advertisement. Women are shown mostly as mothers, wife and daughters-in-law. Basically, a homemaker who selflessly engages herself to maintain her responsibility towards her family and also to her nation or country. According to Krishnan and D. the representation of the idealized woman on Indian television as subservient wife is embedded in and drawn from the Hindu Dharma Shastras. or sources of tradition and right conduct such as the Ramayana and Mahabharata, they argue that two main trends were evident in their study of the representation of women on Indian television. Those of affirmation and denial. Affirmation implied a limited definition of womanhood as passive and subordinate, being tied to housework, husbands and children. Denial existed in terms of the creativity, activity and individuality of women, particularly in relation to work and the public sphere. Women were further stereotyped, they argued, into the idealized and deviant. The ideal woman was caring and maternal. She was supportive of men in their ambitions but had none of her own, being sacrificing, empathetic and home-centered. As a passive wife or daughter, she accepted male control and was devoted to the men in her life. On the other hand, deviant women were domineering of their husbands and did not remain at home to look after the family. Rather than having personal ambitions, they broke up family ties, disrupted male bonding and were not understanding or accommodating enough. In contrast, masculinity is a concept that is made up of more rigid stereotypes than femininity. The normal masculinity has been seen as less restricted and more often associated with power, action and control, thereby shown to be more active, decisive, courageous, intelligent and resourceful. Such stereotypes prevail due to the interplay of power and ideology of certain institutions, market and state, concealing the operation of power within society by characterizing inequalities as natural difference of ability or inclination. One of the main attributes of stereotyping is its relationship to the maintenance of certain relation of power. The media, being the child of state and market, perpetuates these differences so that there would be no threat to the society, thereby privileging the male. The readers of these texts try to actualize them in their real lives and further internalize this inequality or difference between men and women. Now then, Moso, your form is of the manliest beauty, and you are altogether a most attractive object, but you have stood there long enough, so jump in and have done with it. Representation, power and ideology. Stereotypical representations can be seen as reflecting the power relations operating within our society. This idea finds expression when we look into the disputes over Western representation of non-Western people and cultures. The most appropriate example of this is the habitual portrayal of third world women as victims of their own societies by Western feminist scholars. Another glaring example that supports this point that stereotypical representation reflect the power relations operating within our society is Larry Gross' groundbreaking article on sexuality and representation. Gross examines the media as an institutionalized apparatus with the authority to define and frame sexuality, particularly in the case of representation of gay and lesbian people. The media works to symbolically annihilate their lives. The stereotypical depiction of lesbians and gay men as abnormal and the suppression of positive or even unexceptional portrayals serve to maintain and pull the boundaries of the moral order. This shows how heterosexuality is shown to be normal and desirable. This serves the ideological function of gender. One way in which ideology works through media text is by the simple process of repetition. This is particularly true of repeated representations across media forms, which can have the effect of naturalizing a way of seeing an issue, so it seems that no other interpretation is possible. This might serve to be an explanation of the stereotypical representation of women in media. In this context, the ideological work of the media is such that women are represented repeatedly as subordinate to men, so as to accept this subordinate position as being both natural and inevitable and in some way right. In other words, the ideological function of many media text then was to identify for women how they should perform within a patriarchy. For example, the ideology of Griha Patni, which later formed the basis for the concept of Pativrata, is reflected in the portrayal of women in television advertisements as a homemaker, which serves the interest of patriarchal ideology. The media text in this sense is both the container and disseminator of ideology. Conclusion. Let us now quickly recap what we have learnt in this lecture. To sum up, it is a power dynamics between men and women embedded in our culture, which we internalize through socialization, which controls not only media production of images but also interpolates the readers of the media text as subjects. In this way, media reproduces gender relations. In the stereotypical representation of women, media pass on society's heritage, which is deeply sexist, in order to secure continuity, integration and the incorporation of change. For example, in India, the anti-pornography campaigners argue that the media serves the needs of patriarchy by representing women as objects and by suppressing women's experiences. We hope that you are now clear with the concept of gender and representation. Please read the e-text carefully for more details and attempt all the questions given in the end. For more information, please refer to the reading list provided with the e-text. Thank you.